Welcome to The Inquiry with me, Tanya Beckett. Each week, one question, 4 expert witnesses, and an answer. It's January 2021, and a man is being driven through the streets of Rome in a sleek black car. He pulls up outside the gleaming marble Quirinale Palace, where he hands over his letter of resignation to the Italian president. It's a wearily familiar scene. This man is Giuseppe Conte, the Prime Minister of Italy. Since the founding of the Italian Republic in 1948, a Prime Minister has resigned just over once a year on average, and this was actually Conte's second resignation. So this week on The Inquiry, we're asking, why do governments in Italy keep collapsing?
Part 1. Il Duce.
Non abbiamo nostalgie per quel tempo, per quegli uomini, per quegli avvenimenti.
Benito Mussolini became Italian Prime Minister in 1922. He imposed an authoritarian fascist regime on Italy, which lasted until he was arrested in 1943 during the Second World War.
I think the experience had a deep and lasting influence on the culture and politics of the country.
Our first expert witness is Professor Martin Bull, the editor-in-chief of the Italian Political Science Review.
He had demonstrated how it was possible to seize power in a weak political system characterized by deep political divisions. He had banned all political parties, created what he called a corporate state, where the people were apparently represented through different sectors of society. But in reality, this was a cover for a dictatorship.
Mussolini was shot in 1945 whilst trying to flee the country. He left behind him a deep division between those who supported his leadership and those who were against it.
Fascism had been defeated, but it had ended up as a civil war, really, between the resistance movement and the fascists. And at the end of the war, there were still many Italians who had not, given up their sympathies for the man who supposedly had made the Italian trains run to time. And I think it's important then to understand how these concerns, these anti-fascist concerns, were ultimately reflected in the Constitution.
Italy set about rebuilding its political system, this time in a way that prevented the rise of another Mussolini.
Well, the Constitution was founded on the basis of anti-fascism. Its founders, that is the politicians who made up the so-called Constituent Assembly, were above all concerned with establishing a framework which would prevent a recurrence of fascism.
This new kind of politics was difficult, deliberately so. It tried to make sure no single party or person could get things done on their own.
How does it do this? It does it by entrenching minority rights and powers in different parts of the system so that it slows down the system of governance, creating vetoes, blockages, and forcing compromise.
To form a government, different parties had to broker alliances and coalitions, but often they didn't agree, and the alliances broke down.
A small party of the governing coalition may change its mind, for example, as a result of an internal factional struggle, and no longer want to participate in the government.
The result was an ongoing pattern of government collapses. Martin says what emerged was a very polarised and unhealthy political ecosystem. To the left, the communists, on the right, the neo-fascists, and in the middle, there were a number of parties, the largest of which was the Christian Democrats.
3 poles developed: left, centre, and right, representing the 3 subcultures. These were along distance apart.
The centrist Christian Democrats were almost always in power, but they were forced to make uncomfortable alliances with other parties in the middle to keep out the extreme left and right. But the need to keep out the extremes meant that the same faces returned to Parliament again and again, becoming only too comfortable with the power the system gave them.
In occupying the centre, and therefore government for so long, corruption developed, almost as a means of rooting themselves in power in a system that could not provide majority rule. And in this consensual political system, even the excluded parties were given small shares of what was called a kind of spoils system.
In other words, there was a secret web of corruption creeping its way through successive Italian governments over the course of nearly half a century. It became a dark secret shared by Italy's politicians, a secret that was eventually exposed.
Part 2. Bribesville.
Well, I think that we can describe what happened in 1992 using a geological metaphor. There was an earthquake.
Our next expert witness is Alberto Vannucci, Professor of Political Science at the University of Pisa. He explains what happened when, at the start of the 90s, a prosecutor in Milan began to look at evidence of corruption in Italian politics. The investigation would become known as Mani Pulite, the Italian for clean hands. What sparked this inquiry and what did it become?
Well, when they started this inquiry, it was for a very small bribe, just a small amount of money which had been paid by a small entrepreneur to a medium-sized politician in Milan. He was a director, politically appointed, of a public hospice. Mario Chiesa was his name.
Mario Chiesa was a member of the Socialist Party, which was in the coalition government at the time. When questioned by the inquiry, he revealed alarming details about his more senior colleagues within government and exposed a widespread culture of kickbacks right across the political system.
So it was a sort of unofficial but well-known fee that every entrepreneur had to pay, so to say, to political parties to get their protection.
In July of 1992, these explosive revelations culminated in a dramatic scene in Parliament, when former Prime Minister Bettino Craxi took to his feet and addressed his colleagues.
Materia puramente criminale, allora gran parte del sistema sarebbe un sistema criminale.
Bettino Craxi had to say in a public speech at the Chamber of Deputies on the 17th of July of 1992, the whole political system in Italy, the financing of the political system in Italy, as a complex was irregular, illegal.
E del resto, andando alla ricerca dei fatti, si è dimostrato e si dimostrerà che tante sorprese.
If we have to consider such a matter as a criminal matter, so the entire political system, Italian political system, would be considered as a criminal entity.
The results of the inquiry showed that almost everyone in Italian politics was involved in some kind of corruption. The fallout was devastating. In a couple of years, 4 former prime ministers, hundreds of members of parliament, and several thousand local and public administrators had become caught up in the scandal. There were even some suicides. Half of all parliamentarians left the political stage.
The judicial inquiry of Mani Pulite generated a complete collapse of the building, of the architecture of the Italian political system.
How did Mani Pulite affect Italian politics after that period?
Quite simply, all the leading ruling party in the Italian political system disappeared or went into dramatic transformation.
Within a year or two, almost every major political party in Italy had collapsed. The Mani Pulite inquiry had a cataclysmic effect on Italy's political class. It swept away the fragile stability that had been offered by the solid centrist Christian Democrats for nearly half a century. A flurry of new parties emerged, this time against a backdrop of personality politics. And the man at the forefront of this new era was proud not to be a politician, but a billionaire businessman. His name was Silvio Berlusconi.
Part 3. Forza Italia.
Well, I was 14 at that time, but I remember the televised speech in which he announced his intention to run for elections.
Our next expert witness is Giulia Sandri, Associate Professor of Politics at the Catholic University of Lille. She remembers how on the 26th of January 1994, she saw on television a well-known media tycoon who'd established his own party and named it after a football chant. Forza Italia, or Go Italy.
Everything from that message was completely different from what he ever saw before. The type of speech, the lightning, the type of medium that was used, and the whole personalized way of handling this was completely new for that time.
Silvio Berlusconi was elected Prime Minister later that year. He went on to lead the country for 9 years between 1994 and 2013. It's no overstatement to say that during that time, he redefined Italian politics.
Berlusconi launched a new model or a new form of political organization, a model of party that completely relies on the personal, financial and structural resources of the charismatic leader, Berlusconi himself in this case, but also a model that goes in the completely opposite direction of the mass-based parties that characterized the previous 5 decades of Italian politics, meaning the Communist Party, the Christian Democracy, and also the Socialist Party.
In this new era of politics, decision-making moved from mass party memberships to leaders.
And that's launched also another trend in recent or more recent Italian politics, meaning the personalization of politics. In the last 2 to 3 decades, it's the party leaders that are important, that are well known by the electors, and that dominate the political scene.
Berlusconi's Forza Italia was the first of a series of anti-establishment parties with charismatic and headstrong leaders to fill Italy's political vacuum. Others followed, like Beppe Grillo's Five Star Movement or Matteo Salvini's League, and their disruptive influence has only served to make Italian politics more unpredictable. But this new style of politics was not the only force working to reshape Italian governments from the mid-1990s. Italy's parliament also allowed greater proportional representation, giving minor parties a larger role.
Centro Democratico, Democrazia Solidale, Federazione dei Verdi, Fratelli d'Italia.
So there ended up being many more of them, 30 at the most recent count.
Italia Viva, Lega Nord per l'indipendenza della Padania, Lega per Salvini Premier, Movimento Associativo.
This led to a series of unwieldy governments made up of disparate groups with competing priorities.
In order to stay in power, governmental coalition always been, since 1994, very broad, containing elements that ideological could be very distant from one another.
With so much to argue over and very little to hold them together, any one of these small parties' leaders could withdraw their support at any time if they felt their interests were not being represented, or indeed their personality wasn't being given enough room. So perhaps we're getting closer to answering our original question. Why do Italy's governments keep collapsing?
They keep collapsing because, on the one hand, the governmental coalition often are very broad, but also because most of the crises are extra-parliamentary, in the sense the government fall not because of a lack of a vote of confidence or a vote of no confidence, but rather because the party leaders of the parties composing the governmental coalition are in disagreement on a given issue and decide by themselves to create troubles in the coalition, and in the end, the prime minister is compelled to resign.
As we are about to hear, this is just how Italy found itself in its latest crisis. Only this time the solution has come from outside of Italy's tangled politics. Time for our last expert witness.
Part 4. Whatever it takes.
So my name is Anna Bull, or Anna Cento Bull, with my Italian surname, and I'm originally from Italy. I'm professor at the University of Bath.
On January the 13th, 2 months ago, one small party, Italia Viva, withdrew from Italy's coalition government. Its departure was prompted by a row over a huge sum of money handed over by the European Union. The money was intended to help Italy get back on its feet after the pandemic.
So the reason given was that, in fact, the coalition government was going to spend this money unwisely, in the sense that it was going to distribute it as widely as possible and not to spend it in a targeted way. There may have been other reasons behind it, reasons of personal interest, power, and so on.
The offer of funding comes at a crucial time for the country, as Italians' incomes have been decimated not just by the pandemic, but also years of economic malaise. How big a crisis is Italy in right now?
It's in a serious crisis. First of all, there is an economic crisis which has been going on for many years. Other countries have had periods of slow growth, but Italy has had even years of negative growth. So there is a feeling that the country has been in the grips of economic stagnation, and that this has had serious social results.
One of those social results is a youth unemployment rate of over 30%. Perhaps then it's unsurprising that in February, 1 month after the government collapse, the president of Italy, Sergio Mattarella, asked a master of economic management to take the country forward. Mario Draghi had led the European Central Bank for 8 years and guided the single currency through the Eurozone crisis a decade ago. He'd never been involved in party politics in Italy, and he's still an independent today. Why was Mario Draghi thought to be the right man for the job?
Well, for a series of reasons, obviously because he commands quite a lot of credit with the EU. So it was felt that it was important that Italy was governed by a person that was trusted by the EU precisely at the time when the EU was going to grant Italy this huge sum of money, which is quite unprecedented.
Mario Draghi is credited with pulling the single currency back from the brink of collapse in 2012 with the rallying cry, "Whatever it takes." It was an achievement which earned him the nickname Super Mario.
Do you think it's possible that he will usher in a new era of stability when it comes to governments and the frequent changeover of government?
I think that's probably asking too much of Draghi. He is Super Mario. He's certainly Super Mario, but he's not a magician to that extent. I think that will depend on the parties themselves and how they're going to realign themselves. The Draghi government is an opportunity for parties to realign themselves, reinvent themselves to some extent.
Do you think now, in times of crisis, Italian MPs are more likely to behave in a cohesive manner?
Yes, I think the formation of the Draghi government appears to be the result of realization on the part of political parties, even parties which, as I said, have been very strongly anti-establishment, that Italy needs some unity of purpose at this political time. And if you look at other countries, not least the United States, where something like this has proved impossible, I think this is where the judgment of what's happening in Italy becomes positive rather than negative.
The appointment of Draghi is an acknowledgement that Italy desperately needs to impose unity. But our expert witness says the existing way of doing things still has important advantages.
How would you describe the positives of a political system which from the outside certainly seems fragile?
Yes, I wouldn't deny the fragility of the political system. What I would say is that beyond that fragility, there is nevertheless a flexibility in the system that allows even sworn enemies to, at least at times of emergency, work together and negotiate some kind of agreement and compromise, to behave in a pragmatic way and come together, possibly yes, hopefully yes, for the benefit of the country at large.
So why do Italy's governments keep collapsing? Well, part of the reason is history. Scarred by fascism, Italy tried to write a constitution which would prevent any one person or party from ruling on their own. This succeeded, but at the price of a politics which could only function through fragile coalitions which frequently collapsed. Then, when revelations of widespread corruption came to light in 1992, a whole new group of parties emerged, only for Italian governments to eventually fall back into the same cycle, the piecing together of sprawling coalitions which then fall apart. So, as Italy confronts yet another series of crises, including a political one, its history tells us that the answers cannot be found in one person. If change is to come to Italian politics, the whole system, in all its complications and contradictions, has to change too. This episode of The Inquiry was presented by me, Tanya Beckett. The producers were Nathan Gower and Stefania Okereke.
I'm Dessa, the host of Deeply Human, where we find out why you do the things you do.
Why do you fall for him or her?
What attracts one person to another? Why do you get déjà vu? And how does pain change the way that you perceive yourself?
There's a whole bunch of taboos around illness.
From the hidden power dynamics of the standing line to the technological advances that challenge our definitions of death. Join me for Deeply Human, a BBC World Service and American Public Media co-production with iHeartMedia. Just search for Deeply Human.